Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we're going to pick right back up where we left off. In our last lecture we were discussing the administration of George H.W. Bush and the fall of the Soviet Union. Now the fall of the Soviet Union had widespread consequences, not just in the United States or the Soviet Union, but around the globe. The former socialist republics of Eastern Europe all embraced their newfound freedoms. They all opted to leave the Soviet Union. There was this realignment in global power in which the United States became the lone quote-unquote superpower, even though the Russians had not really been defeated and that they still maintained their very large Cold War arsenal and very much remained a power in Eastern Europe and northern Asia. We also looked at the rising troubles around the world, the breakdown of the Soviet Union, removed the cap on all of these various ethnic tensions and conflicts in Eastern Europe. Many of the new states in the Balkans went to war with each other. In the immediate aftermath of the breakup of the Soviet Union, Iraq invaded Kuwait, setting off the first Gulf War, which resulted in a very successful, a very quick military exercise for the United States, in which many of the lessons learned from the failed campaigns in Vietnam of the 1960s and 1970s sort of came into play. And it is at that point that we'll resume our discussion on the first Bush administration and the breakup of the Soviet Union. So has the United States and their global allies, have their forces left Kuwait, or has they descended upon Kuwait, the Iraqis, in an affront to what they deemed the true motivations of the United States' interest in prosecuting the war? The Iraqis set fire to all of the oil rigs and dumped millions of gallons of oil into the Persian Gulf. Now that act had dire environmental consequences, and had dire financial consequences, and did sort of hint at the motivations of the United States. Kuwait then and Kuwait now is a major trade partner with the United States in the region, a major ally, and crude oil, gasoline, and other oil products are a chief beneficiary of that relationship with the United States. Now, with all that said, that act, while being bad for the environment and being bad financially, didn't really have any sort of a direct impact on the war itself. During the war, Iraq had been firing Scud missiles at Israel, and they were unaimed, and these also had particularly no effect. But they were a very effective terror weapon against the Israelis. Not very damaging, but very terrifying. The United States became concerned that had the war wore on, Israel would retaliate against Iraq, and that in doing so would spark a larger regional war with the other Arab powers. Now, during the war, the media was kept out of sight, out of the war theater, and the United States Army exercised great control over information coming in and out of Iraq. It was very heavily propagandic. It's one of the great sort of just visual and audio comparisons you can make is to look at reporting done on the Gulf War in the 90s, and then Vietnam in the late 60s and 70s. It's completely different access. You can also do the same thing with the Gulf War and the early stages of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. No lid whatsoever on the media or what military personnel can say during the second invasion of Iraq and the invasions of Afghanistan, and very tight control over the media. during the first Gulf War. And again, this is one of the lessons learned from Vietnam by the generation that came afterwards. The primary lesson was not to let TV camera film what war is really like, so as to avoid the unintended consequences, unintended repercussions of war and warfare. Now, the media coverage was very ordered, disciplined, and it really just contrasted the hard-hitting expose type of reporting of the Vietnam War, which depicted the atrocities and brutality of war, in addition to the systematic drug abuse among members of the armed forces. Journalists covering the Gulf War reported how well the Army operated, the environmental impact of dumping oil into the Persian Gulf, and of course the brutal, not the brutal course of combat. And again, a very sharp and noticeable change. President Bush took the momentous step of not pursuing the war to a political realignment in Iraq. He did not push for the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. While the United States could have easily marched into Baghdad and overthrown Saddam, the Bush administration would have found itself fighting another Vietnam, having to prop up a government that could not defend itself, that could not stand on its own, and would not be popular with any segment of society, and any sizable segment of society. It was decided that after the liberation of Kuwait, the international forces would disband, leaving in power Hussein's government, whose behavior after the war, namely the chemical use of weapons on civilian populations, made some question the decision. An interesting domestic development during the war was that American military leaders became nationally recognizable for the first time since World War II. General Westmoreland, who commanded the troops during the Vietnam War, was relatively unknown. He was well known during the Vietnam era, and as soon as the Vietnam era ended, he became persona non. Well, he was persona non grata during the Vietnam era. Into the late 70s, 80s, 90s, and even now, General Westmoreland isn't a household name. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell, he became a national figure, as did General Norman Schwarzkopf, who commanded the American ground forces during the first Gulf War. Powell would later parlay his military credit into political capital, who would be a fundraising sort of titan in New York, and he would later be appointed the first African American Secretary of State under the Bush administration. In an interesting domestic development, Schwarzkopf was sort of heralded by all of the major publications. One of his popular nicknames was Stormin' Norman. It's a nickname that I don't really get why they say it, but because there wasn't a whole lot of charging or storming ramparts during the first Gulf War, but he was given a nickname, and he proved to be a popular nickname. Morale during the war had been kept high, quote unquote, or at least they were presented as high. Casualties were kept low. The horrors of Vietnam did not flare up again. After Vietnam, Congress had suspended the draft. Congress suspended. They did not abolish the draft. The draft is simply suspended. And anyone who's ever enrolled at a college or a university, one of the first things you have to do is go into the selective reserve, which is the draft. It's the pool, the draft pool. Congress suspended it, so we had this all-volunteer force. All the military armed forces now contain all-volunteer units unless you get stop-lossed. During the Reagan administration, the government has spent a lot of money on improving military technology, creating better weapons. The Army also had a series of very successful commercials, and the commercials are best remembered had the "Be All That You Can Be" in the Army commercials. They tried to use catchy tunes to entice people, um, which really did help to improve the quality of soldiers. You had a body of men who actually wanted to be there, and instead of people who were simply forced to come in, forced to show up, and forced to perform. Um, After the end of the Gulf War, the new global era was beset by new wars in southeastern Europe. And it should be noted that southeastern Europe was an area that had been just prone to wars, going way back into antiquity. The Greeks were very bellicose people. They fought wars incessantly. Roman conquest didn't really end the wars. The Byzantines, who followed, the Slavs who came in, fought wars. Of course, the Turks came in. They fought wars. It's really one of the world's just most contested areas, southeastern Europe, the Balkans. Um, Communism put a lid on all of these tensions and repressed all of these antagonists. All of these antagonists and really stopped them from acting. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union, these old antagonisms resumed, namely in what was then Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was a composite state made up of many different religious groups and ethnic groups. You had Croats, Serbs, Bosnians, Montenegrins, Albanians, Macedonian Slavs, and they ran the gamut of being Roman Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and of course Muslims. They all had very strong antagonism towards each other, based on either ethnic or religious grounds. The area had a very toxic mixture of antagonistic groups, interwoven in communities like a piece of cloth. Josip Tito, the Yugoslav leader, had been a repressive dictator that kept it all together. And when he fell from power, without him, everything fell apart. With opportunistic warfare erupting, which resulted in ethnic cleansing. A situation very reminiscent of redemption in the American South, following the end of, during and then after the end of Reconstruction. In which there was this very determined effort to simply use brute force to keep minority groups subordinate to the majority population, or to in a lot of cases just that is just kill off large segments of a minority population, trying to drive them from the land, or just trying to kill them and keep them from exercising any sort of solidarity, any sort of solidarity in numbers. The minority groups were decimated so that the majority could have unrivaled dominion over local cities and provinces, thereby establishing ethnic or religious unity in these countries. Now, the international community tried to stop the carnage, but no one wanted to become overly committed to the region. And what was deemed, it was easy to move in and to stop certain atrocity from being committed. It was not easy to pull out, to say, okay, we're done here, let's go. It wasn't that type of situation. There were no clear exit strategies for disengaging in the Balkans. Nobody was willing to shoulder the burden of long-term guardianship over the region, and the fragile democracies. Nobody wanted to appear to be colonizing the area and establishing protectorates or formally annexing the area. Those were deemed any action that appeared to be the actions of an imperialist colonist or an imperialist trying to establish protectorates. They were just diplomatically unacceptable solutions to what was happening down there. The great danger facing the international community was that any force that went into the region simply became another contender among the belligerents on the ground. None of these forces really on the ground, none of these groups really respected outsiders coming in. If an outsider came in, the outsider came in to carve off a piece of dominion for themselves. Nobody was looking at outsiders as being these altruistic, benevolent groups who simply wanted to promote order and security and democracy in these regions. There were a few clear targets and a very murky long-term objective, and everything was complicated by being seen as anyone who went there was implicated as being seen as an imperialist. American politicians began to clamor for a return to isolationism, arguing that with the end of the Cold War, the United States had no real reason, no real interest in policing the globe. Now, others stated that while the United States could deplore what was happening, she should not intervene in every conflict, and that the Republic should be content with setting a strong moral example for the rest of the world. Now, on the heels of the troubles in the Balkans was the genocide in Rwanda, which drew no long-term intervention or proactive solutions. The situation in Africa was compounded by the history of imperialism, colonialism, and racism perpetrated against the Africans, and also the history of imperialism and racism that the United States had to shoulder, that the United States brought into the conclusion. The area was also very with a very low priority. It was really of no strategic importance to the United States. Underscoring these events with a very potent strain of anti-American terrorism. Now, ever since the 1960s, political groups have realized the effectiveness of using terror as a weapon, namely the hijacking of planes or the taking of hostages for publicity and political capital. These acts went on sporadically, with generally no fatalities from among the hostages. In February of 1993, the World Trade Center was attacked at an event that killed 6 people and injured about 1,000. This attack was undertaken by Islamic fundamentalists who saw the World Trade Center has all that was bad. The World Trade Center was the epitome of the worst aspects of American society, American culture, American life to these terrorists, to these fundamentalists. And in their eyes, the United States was this hegemonic global power with vast commercial reach that they used to sort of intimidate, bully, and cow weaker nations, and particularly in their eyes, weaker Islamic nations. The men were arrested and convicted of the attack, but they expressed no remorse for their crimes and were content in declaring the attacks had been the will of God. They received 240 years for the bombings, a sentence of 240 years. Now, domestic terrorism also flared during this time, as Timothy McVeigh conducted a bombing in Oklahoma City. He bombed the federal building in Oklahoma City back in 1995. McVeigh belonged to a group called the Survivalists, who bitterly opposed the reach and extent of the power of the federal government. They regarded the federal government as being the enemy, as being an enemy combatant of all free citizens of the United States. Now, McVeigh was influenced by the Waco affair, in which a religious cult, the Branch Davidians, they had their compound overrun in Waco, Texas, by federal agents, and the end result being the death of over 70 members of the Branch Davidians. Now, McVeigh saw the United States as a tyrannical power, devoted to seeing, and he was devoted to seeing this power overthrown. he saw the United States as being devoted to just chipping. The federal government had chipping away at all of the liberties of the people. And then he wanted to overcome that. Now McVeigh and his group also espoused ideas of white supremacy. So another one of the reasons they did not like the federal government was the new stance, the post 1964 stance of the federal government, in which they supported civil rights for ethnic and religious groups. McVeigh was opposed to that. He said so in interviews, and he also left a small body of writings where he espoused these beliefs. Now, the threat of terrorism became a very costly affair that impacted almost all aspects of life, leading to a kind of paradox. For though the United States was now safer, now the Cold War had ended, and the threat of nuclear war was lifted, the new enemies that were springing up everywhere were more difficult to isolate. They mostly did not correspond with nation states, and in the case of McVeigh, many would be American citizens. And with that, we'll break here, and we'll continue on with our discussion in our next lecture. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment, and let me know what you thought about this lecture.